Hello, hello. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Good afternoon. Today, I will be joined by Erec Smith, who is a professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. At the moment, Professor Smith is trying to get onto his computer. It chose this particular time to update, as often happens. So that gives me a moment to just take care of a little bit of housekeeping real quick. If this is your first time at the channel, I hope you will consider subscribing if you like this sort of content, and then you will be notified if you click the bell every time I make a new video. I've got a lot of great shows coming up over the next couple of weeks, some great guests to talk to you about education. And also like this video, share this video out so people hear it. It's going to be very interesting. And I see that he is waiting for us, so I'm going to bring him online now. Hi, Erec. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly. Wonderful. Awesome.
Yeah, sorry about that. I wanted to get here earlier, but everything went wrong all at once.
It
Students had to talk
happens.
to me after class. My computer decided to reboot for some odd reason, and it never does that. But anyway, I'm here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so, so much for being here. So, let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
First, if you could introduce yourself briefly to the audience. I gave a quick introduction to your professor of rhetoric at, York College, but just a little background, how you get into doing what you do, what you love about it, that sort of thing. Just a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, yes, I am a professor of rhetoric, and a lot of people don't know what that is. Um, Academically, anyway, it is best understood from Aristotle's definition: the ability in any given situation to discern the available means of persuasion. What that means is that each context will both call forth and constrain what we can say. So if I'm trying to convince you to buy my new line of vodka, but you're the president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I'm going to use different language than I would if I'm talking to a frat boy,
Yes.
right? That's really the gist of it. Now, you can expand that out into how we convince masses to vote for people, how we convince them to embrace a certain, national ideology, right, or a certain political stance, right. So we can extend out to that. It can build narratives, right? The stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our lives.
Right.
So it's an inherently interdisciplinary discipline, really. You're talking about language, you're talking about oral communication. To a degree, you're talking about sociology, right? This is all rhetoric. I got into it for that. When I was younger, I had incidents happen to me to make me question the values, attitudes, and beliefs of distinct, not to me distinct, but to them, distinct groups, right? And I was curious about that. And years later, I would come to figure out that I can do that for a living, explore those things. And that's exactly what I did. So I don't know what else you want to know.
That's actually perfect. That's so
Okay.
helpful because my first question was going to be explain to the audience what rhetoric is, and you did it for me. So thank you.
You're
Um,
welcome.
Now, the reason it came up on my channel and why I wanted to talk to you, as I wrote you a little bit in the direct messages, a couple weeks back, I had some teachers as subject matter experts who are actually teaching in classrooms or who are in teaching in universities and exposed to students in that capacity,
Yeah.
talking about what kids are actually not learning in school that they need to be learning in order to be not just knowledgeable but capable, okay, of just functioning. And I don't mean functioning in the most literal sense, but at the level that they would be capable of, their full potential, let's say. And we heard from everybody, math, science, English, and so forth. Well, the both the English language arts teacher who was with us, or two of them actually, there were two, and the math teacher, interestingly enough, because she explained that you need words, and in order to explain math concepts, you're not doing it just in numbers. You have to use words. Um, it was explained to me that when the students are not learning to read properly, okay, they get to third grade and they're not really literate in a functional
Mhm.
sense, that is also going to impede their ability to express themselves long term. That even if they kind of barely keep up or barely keep up, or sort of like trudge along, limp along all the way to 12th grade, um, their ability to think in abstractions, their ability to think and communicate using abstract terms will be greatly limited because their vocabulary won't be there, the sentence structure, like the rhetoric, they won't
Yeah.
understand how to think properly because everything will be, as they described it, in low resolution. That was the analogy. It was kind of like you see something that's pixelated. That will be their thinking capacity because even to the extent that they're teaching writing, and I see this as a writing tutor, they're doing it so superficially, just like, can you construct a sentence that is a sentence, right? Can you construct a paragraph that is functionally a paragraph? But as far as whether it actually makes a point, supports a point, does anything effective at all in terms of why we write, why we speak, why we do anything,
Mhm.
it's just not there. I'm seeing my kids all the way up to, you know, 12th grade. I'm tutoring and thinking, I don't think you could persuade me to have a cold drink on a sunny day. I mean, it it was really kind of depressing. So in other words, that all of this sort of it piggybacks. And I was hoping you could speak to the audience about your perspective on that, maybe explain it a little better than I just have. Why might it be important in K-12 to think about, if you're not directly teaching, but at some point to directly teach rhetoric? Because I don't think they're teaching it. They're not teaching them how to express themselves at all.
Well, what they're not learning, if I'm understanding you correctly, is how to communicate in what's called an elaborate context as opposed to a restrictive context. And what I mean by elaborate is, when you're writing something, you're writing for a potentially very diverse audience, right? Which means that you have to be as clear and concise as possible to make sure that everybody understands what you're talking about. If you're talking to a specialized audience, you can use jargon that only they know, and you can get away with that. Or
Mhm.
you're talking to your friends in your neighborhood, and you can use jargon that you know they understand. You can get away with that. If you're going to express yourself, try to persuade or inform a broader group, you need to have certain rhetorical tools at your disposal. And it's not just about, the mechanics and grammar of things, creating a sentence, creating a paragraph, and things like that. It is about using certain terms that you know your audience would not only understand, but respect,
Right.
right? This is called ethos in rhetorical theory. The credibility that comes off your writing or things like that. You're not going to be able to do that if you don't have a more elaborately coded language.
Right.
And that just means having as many rhetorical tactics at your disposal, from vocabulary to certain figurative language. There's certain metaphors that you can use that some audiences will recognize and others won't. There's certain rhetorical strategies. I'm blanking on the Latin name for this term, but there is a term for saying things like "when in Rome" and stopping there. Right? We all
Right.
know. Well, many people know that the rest of it is "do as the Romans do."
Right.
I once said that to somebody, and she was like, "Why do you keep saying that? When in Rome, do what?" Like she had no idea.
I
Right?
see.
So
Okay.
knowing those kinds of things are good also for interpreting other people's rhetoric. So basically, if you don't have those skills and you're going into society, the more diverse and democratic a society it is, the more non-persuasive or unpersuasive you're going to be.
Right. Right. And so, I mean, one of the reasons I became very curious about this is that I, like you, I spend a fair amount of time on social media reading people's arguments about this or that. And in the context of education, I've read just about every argument there is for and against things like critical race theory or culturally, responsive education and all the different kinds of pedagogies. And what I find remarkable is the way they use words to not communicate. It's almost like I've never seen anything like it. Is there a name for that? And what do you think is behind the ability or lack of ability of people reading or hearing these non-arguments. I wouldn't call them arguments because they don't really complete or support anything. I'm just amazed at how many people don't hear what I hear, or hear something that isn't there, you know? And I is I just feel like people can't think because they don't understand that words need to mean something. Am I missing? I mean, like, I can't express myself very well here. Look, I'm in a show about rhetoric and I can't express myself. Um, it just feels like the rhetoric they're using is almost designed to not say anything of substance.
Well, sometimes it is designed to do that because what you're trying to do is placate people and not give them information that they're asking for.
Okay.
You get this a lot in activist circles these days, especially from people who don't believe in conversing with people who disagree with them, right?
Okay.
They don't want to dignify that other stance with a response.
I see.
And if
Okay.
they do end up having to respond for whatever reason, they may say something vague, meaningless, something that is kind of redundant, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and that may be a way of avoiding real conversation,
Right.
if I'm understanding you
Yeah,
correctly.
no, that is that you are understanding, and one of the reasons I bring it up is not to go down the rabbit hole of that particular subject, but more
Okay.
because when students are in a classroom, any classroom, again, it could be math, it could be science, it could be any subject, but the teachers have a penchant for speaking in that way about the subject matter or teaching the subject matter in the, using this kind of placating language or using very broad vague terms, or terms that they're not going to define. What happens to, do you think, to the students ability to think really critically? I don't mean critically like criticizing, but critically in terms of, what does this actually mean? I mean, when the rhetoric used to teach is this kind of rhetoric, are they going to be able to think if that's how they learn to listen?
Um, that's a very interesting question, especially given the fact that vagueness is a rhetorical tool when trying to recruit
Right.
people. I talk about this in my last book. When you're trying to recruit people and get them into your group, right? You use vagaries. You know, you're focusing on the emotional aspects of things. You know, so you use broad terms that are attractive, right? Empowerment, you know, for example,
Right.
liberation, right? All these kinds of things. What they actually mean in a particular context, that's not important now. You're trying to get them in. The problem today with a lot of activist circles is that once they come in, things are still vague,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's still not an explanation. We're just going off of pure emotion,
Mm-hmm.
pure desire, or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame then that teachers are speaking that way when that's where you learn to explain things in detail and understand things in
Right.
detail,
Right.
right? That's a really scary thing, and I'm trying to figure out why teachers are being so vague when they
Well, I
speak.
think it could be a mixture. Of course, I don't know, but if I had to guess, I would say it's probably a mixture, and I couldn't tell you what percent of each, of people coming up through education having been taught the same way, and also going back into education for activist reasons. In other words, that they see teaching as a political act. Even when I was in grad school at University of Pennsylvania, they said to us, and this is 1989, that teaching is a political act. Here, read, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I'm like, what? That's not why I want to be a teacher, but that was the thing. What I'm seeing in the kids that I'm tutoring, when I look at their writing, not only are they using these vagaries, they are extremely resistant to questions about it or any kind of criticism about it. So, for example, if they try to make a point in a paragraph and they use some kind of term that does not have an objective definition, okay,
Mhm.
and then I'll come back and say, flesh this out. What did you mean by, for example, liberation? Let's just pick that
Mhm.
word. I need to know what your definition of this word is to understand if you made your point. I don't know. And they get all bent like, well, what do you mean? What does it mean? Everybody knows what it means. And I'm like, but no, they don't. And so then I give multiple examples of how it could mean different things to different audiences. And it's even when you're talking to high school students lately, it's almost like it's the first time they ever heard that concept.
Interesting.
And so that's why I'm a little bit alarmed. I taught a debate class as a volunteer in a local middle school when I had 6th and 7th graders. And I realized a few classes into it, I needed to go backwards and spend a lot of time on definition of terms, because they were getting up and doing their debate exercises, just throwing out words
Mm,
without defining what, for the purposes of this debate, the word rich will mean this, the word poor will mean that, the word
yeah.
oppressed will mean, and of course they all want to debate hot button topics. They all wanted to get political really fast. They didn't
Yeah.
want to debate, cats versus dogs or cheeseburgers versus hot dogs. They wanted to get right into it. And so I felt as a responsible teacher, I have to pull them back and show them how their audience could interpret these words very differently. And again, they were shocked. You could see the looks on their faces. We actually stood up and I went one by one. I said, don't talk over anybody. I said, what does this word mean to you? What does this word mean to you? And there were about 13 kids in the class. And I wrote it down on the board. And wouldn't you know it, we had about 13 different definitions.
Yeah. That's why the term operational definitions is important. An operational definition is basically saying this word's going to mean this in this context.
Right.
When I'm talking about this in this speech to this audience, when I say this word, it means yada, yada, yada. All
Right.
right. It may mean something else over there. Right. It may mean something else to us tomorrow, in a certain situation.
Exactly.
So you need operational definitions.
Right.
But here's the thing. This problem has been around since the dawn of time. And it's been around in very erudite circles in, world history. John Locke complained about this. All right. He has a passage in Essay Concerning Human Understanding in which he's talking to a bunch of other intellectuals who are arguing about this term. He says, does anybody have the definition of the term we're talking about? And they all said no and just kept going.
I just kept going.
Yeah, we're just going to keep going, whatever. We don't really know what we're talking about. So, I mean, this has been an issue for quite some time. But the thing is, as educators, there were a bunch of philosophers sitting around in a parlor, right? As educators, the onus is on us to make sure those definitions are clear and to make sure our students can provide those clear definitions. When people bristle when you ask them to elaborate on things, that is often because they understand that what they're talking about can't really hold up to scrutiny, or they're afraid it can't hold up to scrutiny. In my field, because I said so is becoming a valid argument.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but my
I've
students are telling me that too. Like, well, my teacher said this is what I have to do, and I'll say, but did they explain why? No.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
and the teachers are doing that to other teachers.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I've been accused of bullying for saying, can you explain that? That's it. I've been accused of bullying and being insensitive when I said, can you provide, more evidence on what you're talking about, or an example, or just to elaborate on the example you're giving, right?
Right.
I'm the bad guy for it. That's trolling now.
Yeah, I
Asking
don't
for
think so.
elaboration is trolling now.
Yeah.
So I think I'm getting off the
No,
general topic we're talking about
but
here.
I think, but the main thing is I'm trying to connect the dots if they can be connected, and it's sort of an open question for you, between learning to think and learning rhetoric. In this, I mean, I understand there are lots of different ways to think. You're not always trying to persuade, but when we are using reason, okay, and we're thinking about any situation where we don't already know, it's not just a fact like this is a container of mints, okay,
Mhm.
where I'm trying to ask myself and answer, I wonder what this means, or I'm trying to talk to somebody else about something that's a little more complicated. You tend to even use rhetoric in your head. You're using kind of ways of thinking about things where you're taking it apart, putting it back together, and so forth. And what I wonder is, if kids are not being taught how to express themselves as you've described it, how might that be impacting their ability to think critically about these things, or any, to think past just first level, it is this, or someone told me it was this, that's good, I got it, let's go.
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. I'm currently writing a book on the efficacy of empowerment theory and activism and things like that. And one of my points in that book is that a lot of DEI training or any kind of workplace training involving how to get along better or things like that, they skip a key component, and that is called intrapersonal empowerment. And as a rhetorician, I take that as internal rhetoric, interpersonal rhetoric, how we speak to ourselves, right? And I'm not the only one to do that. There are other books out there talking about this concept of internal rhetoric. We skip that. We skip talking to ourselves. How are we talking to ourselves? How are we convincing ourselves to believe this as opposed to that? Is our logic sound? How does this affect our attitude when we meet other people, right? A lot of the problem with trainings is that we skip the intrapersonal, we skip the self-awareness and self-management that is part of the intrapersonal, and we show up without that intact. So when we show up without a sense of self-awareness and self-management, we're not there with an open heart and an open mind, right? We're there to defend our stance.
Right. And that's what I'm seeing with the kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we're skipping that very vital part. And we're starting with the interactional. Now we're starting with working with each other when we should be working on ourselves, right? First.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it's just, for me, like I said, not being an expert in this field, it's more of a gut thing that I started to wonder, like, what's going on up in here. And if you haven't, like I said, it goes all the way back, I think, to learning to read properly. And again, that is not just decoding, but to increase your stamina and your vocabulary on, and your ability to understand more complex sentence structures, more complicated abstractions, and so forth. That's what being proficient at reading is. It's not, I can read a 900-page book with words this big, So I think it's similar to math. You're not going to be able to do calculus if you didn't learn how to do arithmetic. If you didn't learn that, then how are you going to express yourself persuasively? How are you going to have that internal dialogue? And I think it becomes really important when it comes to psychology too. Are you thinking about this too in your book, about things like how you explain some of the bad things that happen to you in your life, for example, things that just occur or things that you can't change? We all have an explanation, right? For like what life is and why things are happening. And what I've learned in my life is that the more simplistic your thought processes and languages for explaining those things, the more likely you are to have faulty thinking. So in other words, to sort of personalize things or externalize everything, like not have the self-awareness, have things be pervasive, persistent, ruminate even over stuff, as opposed to pick it apart and say, well, that was in this situation, not in that situation, and so on. And so we end up with people who are more reactive than thoughtful.
Right. Well, the interpersonal is also about being mindful. And it's also about self-management, right? Being able to respond in an appropriate way to certain situations. That's also part of the intrapersonal component of empowerment. And like I said before, it's missing. But I think what you're getting at more generally is, a kind of insular take on rhetoric and learning how to communicate. What I mean by that is the rhetoric you use at home should be sufficient everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's what a good place, a good world is, right? It's very speaker or writer centered. this way of doing things. Rhetoric is supposed to be about gauging an audience and speaking accordingly, right? Yes, you are presenting yourself as yourself, sure. But in order to persuade that audience, because it's about persuading the audience, it's about getting them to understand something or even getting them to do something, right? Audience is key, right? The available means of persuasion, not the means of persuasion you want to use, right? The ones that are going to get the job done. If being taught, tried and true modes of rhetoric, and being taught standard ways of writing or thinking that other people will recognize is considered a white way of knowing, right? Then to teach that and expect that from certain students is inherently discriminatory, inherently racist, perhaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea, and this is a big thing in my field too, the fact that we can't just talk the way we want to talk in every situation. I'm sure you can, but if you're trying to get something done, if you're trying to get people to understand you, you should have as many tools as possible at your disposal, whether
Right.
they're white or not, right? Um,
Interesting.
yes, I mean I don't ascribe race to particular renderings of ideas or things like that.
I mean, would we say Aristotle was white? It's like it's just kind of
Yeah, people
I
would.
I know, but what I'm saying is after a while, I feel like people bounce back and forth between phenotype and culture, and they can't make
Yeah,
up their minds. It's like
right.
pick one. At least pick one. I don't ascribe to any of it, but could we at least get a consistent operational definition of the word?
Yeah,
That'd be nice. Um, so as far as K12, so you're in a college setting, right? Or
yeah.
are you doing grad student? You're doing college. You're teaching college.
Yes.
Okay. So I assume you're not teaching freshmen though, right? Are they coming to you in upper
I'm
levels or
teaching all levels.
all levels? Okay. So what are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of preparation coming in? Now, granted, there's some selectivity as far as who gets into the school, but even so, what are you seeing? What would you like to see be done in the high schools that might facilitate your teaching? Or I mean, what's been your experience?
Well, I mean, my experience for the most part has been that students are very surface level. They haven't been made to think more deeply about things, and it's my pleasure to help them do that. So it's not a complaint. In fact, I've seen in recent years, I've seen improvements in overall writing from my students. And last semester, I had two classes where the best writers were students of color. To throw that in the face of some of the anti-racist activists going on uh, these days. But my school is kind of an outlier if you look at some other places right now. Not just with what they come to school with, but the attitudes they bring with them. I don't get a lot of like Evergreen State College would never happen here. You know, I mean, I hope I don't eat those words one day.
Yes,
Um,
never is a very long time. So,
yeah, never is a very long time. It just doesn't seem likely at this point,
right.
right? I'm not getting a lot of that. Where I'm getting that is from my field in general. So my students are, the least of my worries. I'm concerned for my students in that I want them to learn as much as possible from me, right? And to understand the importance of rhetoric, both in speaking and in listening, right? Um, but that being said, I'm not worried because I don't have the kind of students who would say you're teaching me a white way of knowing or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
As I said, the tutoring I've been doing, it's sort of across the board. I can't tell you like it's students from here or students from there. They've been from all over the country, but um, the common thread has been, you know, just tell me what to do, or um, there was a word count. I had to meet the word count. And when I ask students why they chose a given word, for example,
Hmm.
they don't have an answer. So
Yeah.
they'll even down to the word choice if they choose a given, adjective to describe something, because one of the things I focus on a lot is show don't tell,
Yeah.
because I have a lot of writers who just give me sort of the news report, you know? And so let's work on showing your audience what you're trying to say, or make it a little more clear. And I'll ask why they chose a given construction or why they chose a given word, and they have no idea. It's like, well, I knew that word, or uh, you know, I heard it somewhere, or the teacher said it. So they don't even have like a reason behind it. And but the biggest thing is it's not persuasive writing. What I'm seeing is they're not writing anything anybody is going to read and take anything from.
Well,
And
I,
that's concerning to me, because I wonder if that's also how they think.
well, it may be how they're settling on thinking. And this is why I sing the praises of problem based learning, right?
Okay.
And it's when you bring improvement science into education. What this means is the writing is authentic. The author, I mean, the audience isn't your teacher or professor grading the paper. Your audience is a real person who needs this information, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Uh, yeah. So, well, I have my students work with, businesses in town who want to, diversify their membership, right? Or make their membership a little younger. My students are working with the Elks Club, in town to help them get younger people into the Elks. So my students have to research that,
Right.
ways of doing that, and then write a recommendation report. And they meet the person, the point person. The point person is involved in the class, and they say, okay, what words do we use so that the people who need to understand this will understand this,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
As clearly as possible. They have to know why they're using certain words. They have to transcend this white way of knowing thing,
Right.
right? Because it's about what this person will understand. When things are pragmatic, we tend to transcend, this focus on race and culture and things like that towards
Right.
getting things done,
I like
right?
that. Yeah, I like the way you put it too, where it might be what they're settling on.
Yeah. The
And
settlement.
right, and because they can. I mean,
Right.
and that's how you play the game. I've said many times these kids are capable of so much more. I
Right.
mean, I have kids all the time that are much smarter, and I'll tell them like, "This is you're better than this. You can do better than this," right? And sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll rise to that occasion, but other times you get, well, but the teacher said it, this, that, whatever. So I'm concerned as a teacher that the teachers are settling for it. You obviously don't, and I'm sure
Hmm.
there are other teachers out there. The one who was on the show obviously wouldn't, but there are plenty. It sounds like who will and who do, and I've run across a few of them. So I just was wondering if it is likely to impact their thinking. It sounds like when you're talking about the interpersonal, that it definitely does. It's missing with the DEI training. What
Hmm.
what do you think about the concept of this culturally responsive? So in rhetoric, you are thinking about your audience and you're trying to persuade your audience, and you have to be, kind of mindful of that, right? From a
Hmm.
teacher's point of view, though, when people talk about culturally responsive pedagogy, are they right? In other words, do they have a point, the proponents of this, that in order to convey information effectively to students in a classroom, you need to use the tools of their culture or whatever? I mean, because, or use the rhetoric of that culture. I mean, that's the point that they're making. And I feel like my personal take on it is, first of all, it's presumptuous. How do you know what their culture is? Second of
Right.
all, it's, aren't you supposed to prepare them for out there, like the general world, for dealing with everybody? And what if that teaches the kid in a subtle way that the world has to adapt to you? That everything is going to have to be like you said, the language of home, or the language that you're used to, as opposed to you have to learn some skills that are outside your comfort zone, and you know that might be what you have to do. What's your take on their whole argument?
Well, as you were talking, with every question you asked, I had like a 4-page essay in my
Oh, I'm
head.
sorry.
So I mean, I have to remember what you said.
Okay.
Um,
I asked too
but
many questions in a row.
no, no, no. So let's just go with is culturally responsive learning or pedagogy rather a good thing?
Okay.
From a rhetorical standpoint, it's theoretically good in that you're gauging your audience and speaking accordingly,
Right.
right? But as you said, it's presumptuous, right? How do you know what this particular culture, responds to the best, right? How do you know that for sure? How do you know every person who is, according to you, a part of that culture abides by those ideologies and rhetorics and things like that? You don't. Now, if you're going to do culturally responsive learning, you have to be kairotic about it. And what
Okay.
I mean by that, kairos is a Greek term often used in rhetorical theory. It is a different take on rhetorical context in that it is the confluence of who you are, what your topic is, who the audience is, where you're speaking, when you're speaking. You take all these things into consideration when you're communicating within that kairotic space, within that kairos. If you do it like that, and you are gauging each individual student in your class and come up with an idiosyncratic response to them and not a cultural response where you're bringing basically stereotypical ideas into the classroom and responding to those stereotypes and not the actual students in the class, that's bad, right?
Right. So, I mean, examples that have been given are, use hip hop to teach vocabulary or whatever.
Uh, I want to throw things when I hear that.
Yeah. But that's literally like in the
I
book
know.
that she's got.
I
So,
know. I've heard stories about people who had that said to them, like maybe we should do this in hip hop,
right.
and they're like, what are you talking about?
Exactly.
But I'll say this: even if you do the kairotic thing, you're trying to get them to a certain place. So if you're in English language arts or something like that, the goal, even though you're using a specialized discourse, all right, let's just put it that way, specialized rhetoric, the goal is to get them to be, sufficient, at least, in this particular rhetoric, right? Because that will be more than likely quite useful in most professional and civic contexts when
Right.
they grow up and go into the world and things like that.
Well, that's my concern with it is that it feels sort of neo-segregationist. And somebody
Yes.
even made that comment in the comments that
Mhm.
how are you actually preparing the student to live in a diverse, pluralistic society where they need to be able to have as many doors open to them as possible if you're going to go ahead and cater to where they already are. So even if you're presenting new information, if you keep doing it in a way that's customized to what's comfortable for them in that moment, the rest of the world isn't necessarily going to accommodate them. So I like your idea of this kairos, but let's face it, in a classroom of 30 kids, it, you
It's
know,
hard to do.
it's incredibly difficult. So you sort of begin to understand why the standardized, format is, and there's problems with that too. Look, I've done it. It's not ideal, but
Mhm.
doing the other requires a level of commitment and labor and time that the average teacher simply does not have. Not to mention an amount of access to the student interpersonally they don't have, to learn about that individual, right?
Yes.
Um, and you could almost get to the point of prying at that point. So I was curious because when you were speaking originally about, the context and know your audience, it almost sounded like, and that's why I think people get taken in by those arguments, right? On
Hmm.
the surface, the real surface is like, oh, well, that seems
Right.
like maybe it could make some sense, right?
Right.
But then what I try to do is I say, okay, but it makes sense only if you have a very superficial thinking about this whole problem, right?
Hmm.
If, for example, if your goal is simply to engage students, right, and just like let's make the day fun, then maybe teaching vocabulary with hip hop might be okay. But if your goal is past that. Engagement is only like, it serves a purpose. It isn't the
Mhm.
purpose. It's not the
Right.
end goal. And so I think what's happening, my personal opinion, is that people are grabbing onto this because it gives them sort of like an easy engagement tool.
Mhm.
Like, oh, cool, we can use drums. People like to be excited about that, and I'm sitting over here going, yeah, but are they going to remember it a week from now? How are they going
Yeah.
to apply this? So, all right, well, this is very, very interesting.
Let me just say that I'm not like against people, in certain situations using, hip hop lyrics, for example. I mean,
Right,
maybe it will happen if they gauge the situation and say, okay,
right,
let's see what. I'm not saying that's bad by any means
right.
whatsoever. Mark Lamont Hill wrote a book. I think it's called Beats, Rhymes, and Pedagogy, and how he tried to use hip hop as a pedagogy, as an educational philosophy. And towards the end of it, he says something, and I wrote a review of this years ago, but I'm trying to remember. He says something akin to, "This didn't really work." Period. Right, and that's at
Okay.
the end.
At the
Right.
end.
So
You're
if he
like,
would have put that in the beginning, nobody would read the book. Right.
right,
So he went through all this stuff and put at the end. Well, it wasn't perfect. You
right,
know. And here's Mark Lamont Hill saying that and writing a whole book about that.
right.
Right. This culturally responsive thing, I understand the sentiment, but it's being used in very naive ways.
Well, let me ask you then, what do you think? And I know it's a big question, but what do you think is missing? Like, what first of all, do you think public school can be saved? I mean, do you have an opinion on it? And if to the extent that you do, or at least, figure like, okay, well, it's here, we got to deal with it. What do you think would engage or help the students who are struggling, irrespective of race? I'm just saying, like, just in general, the kids who are showing up and it's just not happening for them.
Um, well, I'm not an educational, professional or anything like that, especially when it comes to K through 12. So
Okay.
I don't know what can save the public schools or anything like that. But when it comes to engaging students with writing, again, make the writing more authentic.
Okay.
Maybe the problem centered in problem-based learning has something to do with their neighborhoods, and that, in a sense, is culturally responsive, right?
That's true.
It has to do with something that affects their lives. So if they see a certain situation and the group of people involved respond to this dialect in certain ways, then they would be wise to use that dialect. However, if they gauge their audience and realize that although that audience uses that dialect, they
Right.
find more ethos in a more professional dialect, right? Then they'll have to write that. So problem-based learning, in a sense, depending on how you use it, is for students who kind of already understand the value of rhetoric. But it can also be used to teach people the value of rhetoric,
Mhm.
gauging the situation and speaking accordingly. The more problems from a civic and professional space in problem-based learning, the more students will find themselves having to grasp, these forms of English deemed standard, right?
Right.
Or certain rhetorical practices that use certain metaphors because the audience responds to those metaphors more than other metaphors, right?
Right.
Understanding how language works, how we use language to symbolize things,
Mhm.
right? Um, I think that's pretty powerful. So again, I'm going to say problem-based learning
Right.
could do a lot.
Now, before, when I asked you that whole slew of questions in a row, and you said, it's too many things, and you came back and said, it was presumptuous, and you talked about the Kairos. What else would you say to people who are big proponents of the culturally responsive learning, who, for the most part, what I'm seeing are saying, do this, not that. So in other words, not do this in addition to teaching the classics or teaching standard based language. They're saying replace that. That's bad. Like you said, white ways of knowing, white ways of learning, all that. What would you say about that?
Well, that goes along with what I was saying earlier about things being speaker or writer centered instead of audience centered or kairos
Okay.
centered, right? Looking at the whole rhetorical context and writing or speaking accordingly. And as you said earlier, the world isn't going to change to accommodate them.
Right.
What you're trying to do is provide these students with different tools that they have at their disposal when necessary. And I mean, theoretically, a student can go out into the world and never have to speak or write in a civic and professional context. So he or she or they may have needed that lesson less in the long run. But for the most part, that's not the case,
For the most part, right.
right?
I noticed they're doing a lot of journaling too, which is another speaker or writer centric activity.
Yes.
So
Journaling is good though because it can get the gears turning with creativity and things like that, and that's a great way to acquire intrapersonal empowerment, right? Speaking to yourself and things like that. I'm not against journaling. What I am is against journaling being the endpoint. You
gotcha.
know,
Right.
that's
It
what I'm
seems to me
against.
like I remember that movie. Remember, or if you saw it, Freedom Writers. Did you ever see that one about the English
I
teacher?
heard about it and somebody gave me the book to read, and I said sure, and I never read it.
Oh,
So
okay. Well, I only saw the movie. I didn't. But one of the things she did was she gave each kid in her class, and this was the most troubled group of kids in the school. She gave them each a composition book and said, you can write something in it every day, and you can leave it in this closet for me to read if you want, but you don't have to. That kind of thing. I just
mhm,
want you writing, and it wasn't the end point. It was
right.
designed to get them thinking and inside their heads, and there was more to it. But I thought it was a great thing that she did because a lot of these kids really needed to express themselves and get out of their own heads,
Yeah.
because it to get those thoughts on paper helped externalize them enough that they weren't brooding and ruminating and so forth. And then they took it farther, reading Anne Frank's diary and meeting Meep Geese and things like that. So it was pretty powerful. What amazes me is when you see people like that who are successful and have done things that have proven effective, that people don't just pick it up and run with it and say, okay, let's keep doing this. Let's replicate this in other environments because it worked so well. And instead, you'll see other things that are demonstrably not working and people don't want to let them go. That I don't understand.
Well, I mean, what you just described is somebody taking interpersonal empowerment seriously, right?
Right.
That teacher was not skipping that step,
Not at all. She did
right?
a great job. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we see how beneficial it is. Um, in my field, this idea that we shouldn't teach white ways of speaking, writing, and things like that, white ways, right? It's inherently racist to expect people of color to do that. I think that's doing more harm than good. And to the point where a prominent theorist in my field, a very well respected one, who basically wrote several essays, explaining that we can start with where they are, right? Let them, write like the teacher in Freedom Writers, right? Let's have them start where they are, but at the end of the semester, they got to revise things so that it looks like it could hold forth in a civic or professional context, right? So you start where they are, but you still have to get them to where they're going.
Right.
That was considered racist, right? Because you're basically telling them that at the end they have to be white. At the end
Interesting.
they have to be as rhetorically savvy as possible, right?
Hmm.
And find themselves in certain situations and be able to say, I can communicate here. That's the
Yeah.
point. The point is pragmatic.
Right.
There's no value judgment here, right?
Right. Yeah, I struggle with all of this because I don't I don't understand, and of course I'm told I don't understand because I'm white. Um Although this teacher had white students in her class, a couple,
Mhm.
but I mean they weren't the majority, but there were a couple. Um I don't understand how it's specifically white. In other words, I think of somebody like Maya Angelou, who described how she had no books, so she had to go to the local library and read every single book they had in the place because she didn't have any of her own books. And she'd walk herself down there and read all the books. And she didn't know anything about the people who wrote some of these things, including sonnets. And apparently there was a sonnet that she was mad about. I think it was Shakespeare. I'm not really sure, but he wrote a lot of sonnets, so I'm guessing. And she, for the longest time, thought this must have been written by a young black girl because whatever whatever it spoke to her in such a way that she said, "Oh, this person understands my pain. This person understands where I'm coming from," and then projected that and said, must be written by somebody who understands what I'm going through. And of course, later found out that it was a man and, hundreds of years ago and all these things and completely different culture. And what I take from that, I obviously can't ask her what she meant by it, but what I take from it is that if something speaks to you or if there are themes that resonate or it's just expressed differently, like using different words that, like you said, you wouldn't use at home, then it's eternal. It's universal. It's not racial.
A lot of what's going on, and I mean a lot of what's going on at its foundation is a quest for dignity, right? It is the agenda of people who feel like they or their group do not have dignity and are trying to acquire that dignity and make sure that people see them being dignified. That's kind of what's going on here. So, if that's the case, then when you learn another dialect or something like that, then that's not being dignified. That's you, trying to imitate the white supremacists or something like
Oh,
that.
I see.
Maya Angelou, looking at that poem and thinking it must be a young black girl, is proof that a lot of these things are universal, right? But that doesn't seem to matter. I know people in my field who, use the example of Shakespeare. Like nobody in Shakespeare looks like me. Nobody in Hamlet looks like
Othello.
me. Well,
Sorry.
there's that.
Right. But
And bad things happen at the end. So,
that's true.
Um,
Good point.
but the idea that nobody here looks like me, therefore this isn't affording me the dignity I need, is not the strongest mode of thinking, right? I can get something out of Hamlet, right? I have gotten something out of Hamlet. I like Hamlet. Hamlet doesn't have to look like me, right? So this idea of representation, this idea of acquiring and cultivating dignity, that's really a drive to a lot of these teachers, and especially a lot of professors. It's about group dignity, and when it's about group dignity, you're going to shun people who see themselves in a white author, right? You're going to shun people who embrace and have expressed themselves in clear, well, I mean, African American vernacular English can be clear, right? And it is a legit dialect. But just because you have a firm grasp of standard English doesn't mean you've been duped or you've been brainwashed by white supremacists.
You're multilingual.
You're, that's how I think about it.
I mean, like, right? It wouldn't that be? I mean, there are people, I grew up Jewish. There are people who speak Yiddish, right? And
Yeah,
English, and they intersperse like halfway through a sentence. They're throwing words around and everything. And
yeah,
I just see it as you're multilingual. You're speaking different languages, and that should be a plus.
yeah. It should be a plus, and I think people who think it's a minus are totally mashugana.
Yeah, exactly. And they give us all this service. Anyway, no, I've wondered too if the teaching very young children, so pre-rational kind of beings, that they need to see themselves in all the stories and the poems and the,
Mm-hmm.
even the history. Sort of like, well, that history doesn't reflect what I look like, therefore, it's bad or something.
Right,
Or any good that someone did, if they did anything bad, is automatically gone because they don't look like me.
right.
I personally think it's dangerous, not just for the individual, but for the society at large. I think it cultivates a kind of, for lack of a better word, I don't mean this in the DSM-5, jargon, but narcissistic view of yourself in the world that, unless sort of uh, the past and fantasy looks like your reality, or if that doesn't look like what you have now, that it's automatically bad. I think not only are you cutting yourself off from so many important things, and opportunities to learn and grow, I think it's making the individual extremely brittle, and quite possibly sociopathic. Where how tolerant are you really going to be? How compassionate can you really be if the only experiences you'll allow yourself to consume, to read about or consume or understand, are the ones that directly relate to what you look like? It seems like the opposite of inclusion, the opposite of diversity, the opposite of all the things we're supposed to be doing.
The leaders in my field of rhetoric and composition who are pushing anti-racist pedagogy inspired by critical race theorists. I mean, you could call them a den of narcissists, and it would be, in my opinion, accurate.
Wow.
So I hope they're listening right now. But yeah, that's how I see it. That's how I've seen it for quite some time now. And they're often pushing their agendas,
Right.
when they're not really thinking about the students or things like that. It's about their agendas, really.
Right.
But anyway, yes, and it's very me centered, right?
Right.
Or us centered, as in a racial group or something like that.
Right.
And it doesn't take into consideration, society at large.
Right.
You
Right.
need an appreciation for a deliberative democracy, right?
Right.
Participation in democracy, the ability and opportunity to hold forth, to your fellow citizen, right? Rhetoric is obsolete without that ideology,
Mm-hmm.
without the classical liberal ideology that everybody's an individual who can hold forth and has a voice. Well, that voice has to be understood if you're going to do anything, right?
So that's interesting. You just said rhetoric is obsolete without that.
Well, yeah, think about it. I mean, if the there's a period in the history of rhetoric called the sophistic and the second sophistic. Um, in Rome, when there was a republic, you needed rhetoric. You needed to persuade your fellow senators, right? Maybe the people on occasion, right? You needed rhetoric. But when
Mm-hmm.
the age of emperors came into play, rhetoric died as an educational topic, as a profession of sorts, right? It was just performative or epidactic. Um, and it was performative because rhetoric is about convincing people of your way of seeing things, or convincing people that your idea of how to do things is best.
Right.
When only the emperor's opinion counts, right? Anything other than that is punishable. So why do you need to be persuasive?
Wow, I can't imagine why we might be getting to a place where people aren't taught rhetoric and aren't
Yeah,
really using it very much. Oh my goodness, it's all becoming clear. Oh
you
dear.
don't need it in a totalitarian context.
So I started off thinking, we're going to talk about what the kids aren't learning and what they need to learn, and then now I'm coming to the realization that it might be working exactly as they'd like it to work. They don't really want them to be persuasive.
Yes. Well, I mean, more than one person has called this all this anti-racist activism a Trojan horse for Marxist thought. That's not a new idea. A lot of
Right.
people are
I mean,
talking
I've
about
said
that.
that. I've
Yeah.
said that, but I guess I haven't, and I've thought about it to a pretty granular level, but not even this granular. I didn't get
Yeah.
down to the point where, I've said I think some of these ideas are neo-segregationist. I think I've always thought, literally always thought, that the public school system was the most systemically racist system in the country.
Hmm.
If I'm looking at everything from the beginning to now and how it's been run, it's just been almost designed. Maybe it's accidental, but it feels like it's been awfully successful at perpetuating a certain measure of inequality and making it worse and worse and worse with every passing year, and
Hmm.
and when it should have been going the other direction. And so that's part of why I'm an abolitionist. or some people call it like an extreme school choice person, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it. Because I feel like it's failed, and parents need to have the option to, take their education dollars to something that will not fail their children. Every child has, I believe, it's sort of an inalienable right to be educated, not to be compelled to sit in their zip code zone school, especially if it's a complete failure. But now I'm starting to think that maybe there's more intention behind this than I even thought, because we know there's intention behind these pedagogies. We
Hmm.
know that people are pushing these specific ideas, and then what I'm wondering is maybe we need an operational definition of dignity,
Yeah.
because let's give people the benefit of the doubt that not the people at the tippy top pushing it, but the
Hmm.
people down below who, as you say, are looking for dignity. Okay, let's respect that. Let's look at that. What would be an operational definition that we could look at and then say there's a better way to achieve that?
Well, I would say empowerment and empowerment theory, which is composed of three separate components. We talked about the interpersonal,
Right.
how we speak to ourselves, the interactional, how we speak to others, how we are aware of our context, our situation, so that we can interact accordingly
Right.
and productively, and the behavioral, how we work together to get things done, to accomplish things,
Right.
right? Um, an operational definition of empowerment that follows empowerment theory, I think, would be very beneficial.
Yeah. That would be. And because I keep coming back to, dignity for a group. I don't I, I do Is there the perception that white people have dignity as a group?
Yes, I think there is.
Interesting. Because as a white person, like that's all I've ever been, I don't feel like that. Like, in
Well,
other words, I think maybe like I have dignity or another individual has dignity, but I don't think of a group of people, intrinsically have, dignity. If that makes
well,
sense.
you're abiding by the classical liberal tenet of individualism,
Mm,
right?
I
And
think I'm
that's what
stuck
you,
there.
right. Well, it's I am proud to say I also embrace that. You know, and you're not seeing yourself as part of a group. You're seeing yourself as an individual. Well, people would say you're being naive. You are part of a group, and your group is hegemonic, and therefore it has a substantial amount of dignity, and you're fine, right?
Okay.
Um, that's
I've
what a lot of
traveled all
people
over
would
the
say.
world though. Like I traveled to the East Bloc countries when they were still East Bloc countries, and
Uh-huh.
they're predominantly white, right? And I've seen some pretty bad stuff.
Yeah,
So I don't even have to go to Appalachia. You know what I mean?
yeah,
I've been to some places in this world where, I've been to parts of Ireland that are still pretty poor. Not to
yeah.
this day, but what back like decades, like a couple decades ago, where things were not so awesome. And so I wonder too if it's a matter of perspective. You know,
Sure, but they don't. A lot of the people, I'm saying they, as if every anti-racist activist is based in critical social justice or something like that. They are not. I like to think I'm anti-racist. I'm not
right,
CRT or CSJ.
right.
But anyway, um, wait, what were we talking about?
So we're just talking about dignity and like the percent. Some people would say I'm naive,
Yes, 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 yes,
and
yes.
because I'm an individualist and I don't think that white people have dignity as a group, or striving for dignity as a group or whatever, and they're saying I'm naive and I don't understand it. I genuinely don't understand. I'm not being snarky. I
Right.
genuinely don't
And
understand.
you said something about the fact that they're not taking in other perspectives,
Right.
right? They're not supposed to. The taking in other perspectives is going against the preferred narrative, right, of grievance,
I see.
of white supremacy, and things like that. Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is antithetical to that, especially when that somebody else, you know, doesn't embrace victimhood
I
or
see.
grievance or something like that. It is a concerted effort not to respect other perspectives. So you're not going to get them to do that. There is and I've been talking about this more and more lately. Kenneth Berg had this idea of comic and tragic.
Yeah.
A comic situation is when people mean well, but they're misguided. Tragic is when people are not misguided; they just don't mean well. They have they're acting in bad faith. right? We have both of these people, in anti-racist circles. But the people with an agenda are going to stick to that agenda and shun anything that threatens that agenda. I wrote a Newsweek article about being, a personified threat to that agenda just by being a person of color who doesn't embrace victimhood and does embrace classical liberal values, right?
Right.
And they have to erase and replace me, get rid of me, basically. Same
Right.
thing with perspectives in general,
I
right?
see.
They have to push that away. It's all about this narrative.
It just seems very dangerous to me. I,
Well,
I, it seems very dangerous because if there's liable to be, you can reject people's perspectives for only so long, and then if it becomes if your rejection of other people's perspectives results in harm to them, some kind of material harm or threat to them or their children or whatever, then you end up with something called blowback, right?
mm-hmm,
And so what I don't understand is how some of these people who have this agenda don't see the real danger in this kind of essentialism and rejection of compassion, rejection of, this some kind of, I don't know, mutual respect at least, because I don't see that going anywhere good in the
well,
long term.
I think they're going for that, right? Everything you just said, the negative stuff. I mean, a lot of people want that. They want things to crumble, to fall apart. They're fine with it, and this is where the whole Marxist conspiracy theory, I guess, comes into play. But a lot of what they do is straight out of the Marxist playbook.
Right.
Playing with language, saying things are up when they're down. You know,
Well, that's a
all these.
rhetorical thing too. What's that called? When is there a name for that when people use, say the opposite, or it's like projection. People talk about it. James Lindsay says the iron law of woke projection, where they're telling you are what they are and things like
Uh,
that.
yes, I don't know how. I don't have the official term
Oh, there's
at
not an
the top of
official
my
term.
head right now,
Okay.
but I'm sure there is one.
Okay.
Right?
It's like Orwellian. I mean, this feels like the opposite, but I this is so interesting to me. But I've always been fascinated with the usage of words and how people use words. You were going to say,
Intersay pugnantia.
sorry?
Intersay pugnantia
That's what it's called?
is close to what you're talking. Yes, yes. It's when you basically use somebody else's words against them. In a sense.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I mean that's close to what you're talking about. But that's the
Right.
only thing I can come up with right now.
Right. Well, one technique would be to change the definitions of words. So suddenly,
Yes.
when you talk about things like individualism or individuality, which I grew up believing was this worthy goal, individual liberty and
Well,
your individual rights and all the stuff that was supposed to be this great thing.
it's a
And
wonderful goal if you are all about classical liberalism, and liberal humanism. It's a wonderful goal there. If you're not for that stuff, it's an awful goal that needs to be squelched.
right. But they don't just want to squelch it and say individualism is bad. It's got to be made evil.
Yeah,
It's because initially I think it was like, well, individualism is selfish, or individualism won't solve problems, or individuals, can't be counted on to do XYZ, right? That was kind of like this soft peddling of it. And now I feel like it's gone full tilt to like individuals are evil,
yeah,
and that's what concerns me because when children in particular are trained at an early age that they are merely group members, or they have a group identity, and here they are, here's your group identity. Your individual identity is not as important as your group identity. It defines you, and most of these things you didn't even choose. Then have no tools to defend yourself or to even maintain your own sense of self-worth if at any point in your own evolution you find yourself at odds with the group, anything the group wants to say, wants to do, whatever, if you're like, whoa, no, don't want to do that, don't want to think that, don't want to say that, you have nothing.
yeah,
Your own, especially if they start young enough, it can attack your sense of self to the point where you could do self-harm, where you feel like you literally are nothing.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
your cost of leaving the group is very, very high. It's almost like we went from, if your friends were going to jump off a bridge, would you do it? To, your friends are about to jump off the bridge. Let us give you a leg up. Like
Mhm.
that's important. You should follow them. That I was taught the exact opposite, along with sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. And now we've gone full tilt to the way you looked at me was a microaggression.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even have to be words anymore. It could be looks, gestures, lack of looks, smiling too long, all these things. But we're getting off topic, and I've used up a lot of your time. I guess uh, as a final question, it would just be, how can those of us who are outside of the system, or even inside the system, but want our kids to learn more about rhetoric, what aside from those wonderful problem-based learning opportunities that you described, which I think are fantastic as a homeschool parent, I think those would be great ideas. Are there any other things that you suggest, or you said you're coming out with a book. What's the name of your book again, and when can we get
Um,
it?
I'm not quite sure of the name of the book. It's
Okay.
actually I'm yeah. I don't want to talk about that right now.
Okay. Okay.
It's I haven't
Someday
I've
he's gonna have
seen
a
the
book.
cover and I like it, but we haven't
Okay.
decided on
So
it.
someday you'll have a book. But in the
Okay.
meantime, what else do you recommend that we read? Like, what do you read? What should we?
What should we read?
Yes.
Rhetoric and Civic Life
Okay.
is something people should read. I use that course in I use that book in a course called Civic Rhetoric.
Okay.
It's called Advanced Composition now. We're gonna change the name in the very near future.
Okay.
Um,
Rhetoric and civic life.
Rhetoric and Civic Life. It's basically it's more of a textbook than anything like that, but you get the general idea of what rhetoric is and why it's important, in a deliberative democracy like ours,
Very
right?
good. Okay.
That's a good place to start.
Okay.
My goal, my dream, this is going to sound crazy.
I
My
get it.
dream is to make my job obsolete because everybody is so steeped in rhetoric, they don't need a rhetoric professor.
Right.
You
Good luck
know,
with that.
yeah.
I think no. I think you'll be working till you die. Anyway, but you got job security, so there's that.
There's that.
Um, who are some thinkers that really keep you going? And if there are people we can follow, at Twitter or whatever, who are some people who inspire you and kind of keep you grounded as far as this kind of stuff that inspire you to keep going?
Nothing really. I just drink a lot of whiskey. I
Oh,
don't.
okay.
Yeah.
So there's nobody out there you're like, oh, they're they got it going on, or okay.
Not really. I mean, Kenneth Burke's work is something I really find myself pushing more and more, as well as James Berlin,
Okay.
who's done a lot of work and acknowledges, the importance of Kairos and things like that. These are thinkers that I really tend to embrace. I
Okay.
like this guy named Erec Smith too. His writing is pretty
Yeah,
good.
he's awesome.
Yeah.
I've recommended him to many people.
These are jokes, people. I keep forgetting we're live,
Yeah.
and you can't edit that out. I,
No,
I keep forgetting.
no, it's
Sorry.
okay. But I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on here and answer my very convoluted questions. You're
It's
like,
fine.
which one do you want me to answer? I do that. I kind of get out ahead of myself. I'm very sorry. But it was
It's fine.
really interesting and enlightening. And I know that the audience appreciated it. So thank you so much. And I will be looking for that book. Very excited about that.
Okay, I'll
All right.
definitely let you know when it's available.
All right, great. And those of you who were joining us today, thank you so very much. If you enjoyed this, please share it out to your friends, family, anybody who'd be interested in rhetoric and why it matters, okay? Because it does a lot. All right. All right. Have a great day, everybody.